Hi, I wanted to talk a little bit more about non-experimental approaches to research and give you a little bit more information on some of the different ways that we do research in psychology besides correlational studies and experiments. So we're going to talk about 4 different types of non-experimental approaches to research. We're going to look at naturalistic observation, we're going to look at surveys, we're going to look at archival research and case studies. So naturalistic observation is just what it sounds like. It's studying people in their natural environment, sometimes animals as well, and making observations about it. We've gained a huge amount of information about child development just from naturalistic observation. We can observe 3-year-olds and see what skills they're capable of versus a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. We can look at physical skills. We can look at cognitive skills. Are they reading? Do they understand words? All sorts of different skills that we can look at in child development just by observing kids in their natural environment. So naturalistic observation is a really good way to gain information. There are some drawbacks to naturalistic observation, and one of the main drawbacks is that people behave differently. Even kids sometimes will behave differently when they know that they're being observed. If we know that the big boss at work is coming in on a particular night that we're working, we're going to behave differently than we would have had if we didn't have that information. So people normally will behave differently if they know that they're being observed, and animals also do that as well. So Jane Goodall she's still alive today. She's a researcher. She's studied gorillas, and there was a movie in the 1980s about her called Gorillas in the Mist. And what she did, she was very concerned about the habitat for gorillas, and she really wanted to understand gorilla behavior. And what she did to sort of overcome this idea that these gorillas would behave differently in the presence of a human, and even animals will definitely behave differently in the presence of others. So she sort of became one of the gorillas. She lived with the gorillas and became a member of their group, basically. And then she was able to really observe their behavior in the natural environment. She was able to dispute this whole theory. So back in the 1950s or so, when she was doing her initial research, there was a lot of research trying to prove that humans are better than animals for whatever reason. And one of the things that scientists believe separated us as human beings from animals was the ability to use tools. And Jane Goodall was actually able to discover that the gorillas actually use rocks and sticks as tools to complete different tasks, and that she was able to dispute that theory, that animals use tools just like humans use tools. So really interesting and useful way to gain information. But the environment is difficult to control. Sometimes you might be trying to observe a particular behavior, and you might sit there for an hour and never see that behavior. And one of the things that we do sometimes in naturalistic observation is what we call a structured observation, where we might set up a situation and then observe how people respond. We might give a little kid a task to do and see if they're able to do that. I don't know if anybody watches that TV show, What Would You Do, where they set up a crazy situation and see how people respond to it. We do that as psychologists as well to gain information about people's responses. Another way that we gain information is through surveys. In the 1950s, Alfred Kinsey did a survey on human sexuality. And if you can imagine, back in the 1950s, people did not talk about sexuality at all. And he was sort of made fun of and called a pervert and things like that. But he helped us really understand a whole lot about human sexuality, sexual dysfunction, and homosexuality. Surveys can be really economical. We can reach a lot of people with surveys, and it also allows for anonymity. And in Kinsey's case, that the ability for people to reply anonymously made it possible for him to get information that he wouldn't have been able to get otherwise. Back in the 1950s, it was not acceptable to be homosexual, and people would never have shared any information about that. But because they knew they were anonymous or felt comfortable that they were anonymous, they were willing to share a lot of information that is still really useful and important to us today, and was certainly useful at the time. So surveys are a great way of gaining information. and we use them a lot in psychology. Archival research is just where we take existing information that we already have and we manipulate that information to find out different information. So, for example, we might look at a person's freshman college grades, and then we might want to look at them a couple years later and see if they actually did graduate or transfer to a university. And that gives us good information. If somebody's struggling in their freshman year, does that mean they're not going to graduate? Is there a way that we can intervene? So archival research is an interesting way for us to do research. This is kind of a fun survey. It was a global sex survey that was done in 2005, so 15 years ago. So you might dispute some of the answers on here, but think about it, this is worldwide, so it's not just in the United States or just here in Arizona. So the statistics might be a little bit different if we just did people in Arizona. But it's just interesting information. And for us in psychology, this isn't just for fun. We kind of really want to understand what's the norm. What are most people doing in a particular country at a particular age? And that way, when we have a patient that maybe has some concerns, we know what's normal, what's not normal. So something to think about. So the first question is, what percent of people are happy with their sex life? Apparently only 50%, so that's pretty sad. Which country has the most sex? Greece, apparently. The least sex, apparently, is Japan. And these surveys don't give us information about why this is the case. We can make some assumptions about why they have less sex in Japan, maybe traditional values, maybe religious values, but we really don't know. The surveys just give us the information, and then we may want to do additional research from there. So this one was interesting. So the average age for losing your virginity. In the United States, for males, it's supposedly 16.9, and for females, it's 17.4. And then I found it interesting that in Iceland, apparently, it's a lot younger. I don't know why. It's cold there, I guess. I don't know. And then in India, it's older. And that probably has a lot to do with religious beliefs and rules against premarital sex. So interesting to see how things are a little bit different around the world, too. So this last one is the worldwide average number of sexual partners. So this is how many sexual partners you have per lifetime. And the average number is 9, and they actually separate it out for men and women. So there's still a double standard here. So 11 for men and 7 for women. But this is interesting information and useful information in psychology. The last way we're going to talk about getting information in psychology is through case studies. These are an in-depth study of an individual or group. Case studies can give us a lot of information, but one of the problems with case studies is they're not necessarily scientific and they might not translate to the general population. But there are some cases where all we can do is use a case study to study the person. I don't know if any of you saw this movie, Rain Man, back in the 1980s. If you haven't, it's a great movie with Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman plays an autistic savant. And this whole story is based on a true story in a man named Kim Peek, who was an autistic savant. And what that means is that the person has very severe autism, may also have a severe intellectual disability, but they have like a remarkable talent in a different area. Some of them have remarkable musical ability. In Rain Man's case, he had this remarkable ability to memorize information. He memorized the whole phone book, half the phone book, it wasn't the whole phone book, half the phone book while he was sitting in a hotel room, and he was able to recite the waitress's phone number and address back to her, which she wasn't too impressed with. But case studies can give us a whole lot of information. Freud's research was primarily based on case studies of his patients. Freud was actually a medical doctor, and he would see these women he'd have these women coming into his office saying that their arm was paralyzed or they couldn't feel their hand, and he would examine them and he couldn't find anything physically wrong with them, and he started to think that maybe there was something psychological going on with these women, and so he would spend hours talking with them, asking about how, listening to how their lives were going and what was going on in their lives. And he actually found that the women felt better and their symptoms went away after talking about their lives for a while. And so a lot of his research is based primarily on case studies of his patients. Anna O was one of the famous patients that he wrote a book about, and she had many symptoms of hysteria. I think his book was called something about hysteria. So he based most of his research on case studies of just in-depth studies of his individual patients. And he's criticized a lot because of that, because there's no way to scientifically prove any of his theories or ideas. They just came from study of his individual patients. But, Sigmund Freud, as much as we like to make fun of him, he came up with some really brilliant ideas. The idea that our childhood affects us in adulthood seems simple to us today, but back in his day, people thought children, anything that happened to kids was not a big deal because they would not affect them as an adult. And then he also came up with this idea that we have part of our mind that we're not necessarily consciously aware of that sometimes controls our behavior and our thoughts. And he was accurate in a lot of his information, and he was the first person to really do talk therapy. And so really important psychologist in the history of psychology. So when we use case studies sometimes to study rare conditions, sometimes we also look at, and this last one I'm going to talk about is brain injuries. Back in the day, today we have pretty sophisticated brain scanning techniques to help us understand what parts of the brain do. But early on, we had no information about that. And so sometimes when people had severe brain injuries, it helped us to understand what that particular part of the brain did because we had no other way to do it. So the story of Phineas Gage here is that he was a foreman working on a railroad. They were blasting through a mountain with dynamite to make way for the railroad tracks. And he was tamping down, this is called a tamping rod that he's holding here. He was tamping down dynamite, and you're supposed to put, I guess, gunpowder and then sand over it, and he missed the step of putting the sand in there. And so as he was tamping down on this dynamite or gunpowder, this rod blasted through the front part of his head. And you could see he lost his eye here, and part of his skull, and also part of his brain came out with it. The skull and this tamping rod are actually in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., which is kind of interesting. But he seemed okay right after the accident. He was sat up, he walked around, he was talking, he seemed pretty okay. He went to the doctor, and the doctor was pretty concerned about him, but sewed him up, and, he healed up, and he seemed like he was doing okay physically, but people noticed that he was really a different person, that he had huge personality differences. He was considered a really nice guy beforehand. He was very organized. He was liked by his employees. And after the accident, he became the kind of a really surly guy, very disorganized, swore all the time, really unlikable person. So this gave us kind of our first information about the frontal lobes of the brain here and what the function of those frontal lobes are. So it was a really interesting case. So, and poor Phineas, he actually did die 10 years later of really severe seizures because of this head injury. And back in this time frame, 1848, there were no medications for seizures, no treatments for seizures. And, people that suffer from seizures today, if they aren't treated, it can cause really severe brain damage and death. So something to think about. So anyway, that is it about the alternative non-experimental research methods for psychology. Thanks for listening.